Muy buenas tardes, compañeros de la Universidad Casa Grande, señores profesores, compañeras profesoras, señores padres de familia, para todos ustedes una linda tarde. Empezamos otra semana más de la webinar de la Universidad Casa Grande, que en convenio con el Fondo de Cesantía nos otorga la posibilidad de tener estas tareas, estos cursos de capacitación que nos permiten mejorar en nuestra vida diaria. Quiero recordar que la Universidad Casa Grande desarrolla estas importantes webinars para que los maestros conozcamos la calidad de catedráticos que existe en la universidad, así también como su manera de educar. Yo creo que en todas las semanas que ya avanzamos con este proceso nos sentimos muy satisfechos porque hemos avanzado mucho, no solo como maestros, creo que también hemos mejorado como madres, como padres de familia, que a la vez nos permite mejorar en nuestro ámbito social y educativo. Quiero decirles a todos quienes se conectan a esta webinar que la Universidad Casa Grande nos permite a todos mantener una relación estable en nuestro trabajo. Hoy que estamos tan, creo yo, maltratados por el sistema educativo ecuatoriano, por los gobernantes de curso, la Universidad Casa Grande, al entregarnos estos cursos gratuitos, nos está permitiendo mejorar. Quiero agradecerles a ustedes, a la Universidad, al Fondo de Cesantía, por permitirme ser parte de estas importantes webinars y aprender, mejorar como esposa, mejorar como madre, mejorar como amiga, mejorar como maestra. Un abrazo, sean todos bienvenidos. Buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes. No. Thanks, Norma, for those words. Hello, everyone. My name is Hugo Velasco. I'm the academic coordinator of the master program. And it is a pleasure for me to introduce to Dr. Janine Dara. She's a teacher of our master program, and she will be talking about a very interesting topic today. A little bit from her. She's from Ohio. She holds a PhD in philosophy, language and literacy education from Washington State University. Welcome, Janine.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. Well, I'm gonna check my time and share my screen.
Yeah.
Good?
We can see it, yes. Thank you.
All right. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what trauma is, how it affects the brain, and what that means for our students in our classroom and us as teachers. Some classroom strategies to support students who have experienced trauma, and then a little bit about what secondary trauma and trauma fatigue are, which you as a teacher might experience as well. So trauma, any events that, an event or a series of events that an individual experiences that are emotionally, physically harmful or life-threatening, that have lasting adverse effects on the individual's ability to function, mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So we all have some bad or sad experiences, but when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about maybe for an extended period of time or something that's so difficult that it is hard for us to be able to carry on. So there are different types of trauma. Acute trauma is a single incident. So for example, if you had a car accident, that might be an example of acute trauma. It happened one time. Chronic trauma or multiple incidences over time. And with chronic trauma, for example, if we have students whose parents struggle with addiction or mental health, that might be an example of chronic trauma. It happens fairly regularly in the students' lives. Complex trauma is 2 or more traumas at the same time. Insidious trauma is indirect trauma due to living circumstances. So if, for example, my neighborhood is unsafe, and I'm afraid to walk to school because of that, that would be an example of insidious trauma. And then historical trauma is multi-generational, and there's some evidence to support that we actually pass down trauma through our DNA. So here in the United States, we have an ugly history regarding slavery and people of color, and so that might be an example of historical trauma that is passed down generation after generation. So several years ago, there was this huge study done in the United States by a doctor who found out he had patients who had all kinds of ailments, maybe diabetes or asthma, chronic health problems. And when he started talking to them, he found out that a lot of them had had struggles in their childhood, these adverse childhood experiences. And what he found was that the more of these adverse childhood experiences you had growing up, the more likely you were to struggle with physical health when you were an adult. Also, you would have more trouble maintaining a healthy relationship. Maybe your weight, you would have trouble with your weight, and have trouble with school and holding and sustaining a job. So you can see these adverse childhood experiences, abuse, neglect, growing up with a family member who struggles with mental illness or addiction. And again, the more of these you had, the more challenging it would be for you to be successful in adulthood. So when we look at those, it becomes pretty obvious that as teachers, we're going to have students who have experienced trauma. And so I think it's important to spend a little bit of time understanding how trauma actually affects the brain. So brain science can be super confusing. I like to use this model of the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain. And I like to think of this as being my brain. So this is my spinal cord, and this is my downstairs brain, and this is my upstairs brain. And right here in the middle, these are my emotions, my thumb. So what happens is when you're born, your downstairs brain is fully developed. So the downstairs brain, that is responsible for things like breathing and digestion, those basic life functions. And then as you grow older, you develop your upstairs brain. So you develop these neural pathways, which are kind of like ladders that lead you to the upstairs brain, where you have thinking and dancing and movement and empathy, and also things like emotion control. So when we think about, for example, a baby, when a baby is born, they can't always control their emotions. They can't control their emotions at all. They cry when they're hungry, and they cry when they're tired. Now, as we get older, hopefully, for our friends and family, we don't cry when we're hungry and tired, although sometimes we do, right? Or I do, not always. Anyway, so what happens is when you have experienced some sort of trauma, you have all of these stress hormones that flood your downstairs brain, and it makes it impossible to take those ladders to the upstairs brain. So your nervous system releases these stress hormones, your heart rate increases, you have more blood to your muscles and to your brain. So I don't know if you've heard stories about if a car falls on someone and they have superhuman strength to lift that car off of them. Or maybe if you're being chased, you have more stamina or can run much faster than you've ever been able to run before. And this is because those stress hormones are flooded into your brain. You're not thinking about poetry, you're just living in that downstairs brain. So when you're a baby, you develop these cortisol receptors, which help to sweep that stress hormone out of your brain, so you can function again normally. Children who live in chronic trauma situations develop fewer cortisol receptors. So it becomes harder for them to access their upstairs brain, the part of the brain that's responsible for thinking and learning and emotion control. And so we can think about this with, for example, if you're in a very stressful situation, if I go to the dentist and the dentist gives me some bad news, often I don't remember a thing that the dentist told me when I get home. And that's because I had the stress hormones that were making it harder for me to think and to remember. So what does this mean for us as teachers and our students as learners? So if our students are constantly living in their downstairs brain because they have a lot of stress in their lives, you will see it in a lot of different ways. Behaviorally, they might be absent more. They might sleep in class. It's exhausting to be stressed all the time. They might be acting out. Again, they have trouble with that behavior control and regulation. As far as learning, because it's harder to access that upstairs brain, there's going to be challenges with attention, concentration, memory, all of the things that are important for us to do well in school and to learn a new language if we're language teachers specifically. So all of that news seems really, really sad and depressing, but there is good news. And so the good news is this big word called neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to rewire itself and form new neural connections. Or when I was talking about the ladders to get to the upstairs brain, you can form new ladders if your ladders have been washed away by the stress. So brains are flexible, children are resilient. We often see this if, for example, someone has a stroke or is in an accident, maybe they need to relearn how to walk again or talk again, and they can. It just takes a little bit of time. So trauma symptoms can be reduced or reversed, and the thing that's most exciting and uplifting to me is that research shows us that for children to be resilient, what they need is one adult who cares for them and provides support. Now, of course, we would hope that that one adult would be a parent, a mother, a father, a grandmother, but it doesn't have to be a family member. It can be a minister or a neighbor or a priest, and it can be a teacher. So we can be that person in another person's life to help them recover from trauma that they've experienced. So I have talked a lot in these first minutes. So one thing that I like to do with students is to give them a brain break so they can reset and focus again. And I can't see any of you, but I am hoping that you will do this with me. So there are a lot of fun breathing exercises that can kind of recenter us, especially if we're feeling stressed and living in our downstairs brain. One is 4 + 1, and I'm hoping you'll do it with me. So just breathe in for 4. Hold it for 1. And then breathe out for 4. With young children, I like to do the same thing with soup. So you can smell your soup and you can cool your soup. And you can do this, as you can see, with the picture of the flower or blowing a leaf. You can use props. You can have students blow a balloon or take a straw and blow a cotton ball. And again, this physically recenters us. When you blow, you physically relax a bit, which can help reset our brains for learning too. So, what can we do in the classroom? The best things we can do are build relationships, make our students feel safe, engage in choice and collaboration, and encourage skill building and competence. And these are called trauma-informed classroom strategies. I think they're just good teaching strategies in general, but they'll be especially helpful for students who have experienced trauma. So, building relationships, patience, listening, and caring. Sometimes it's really hard when you have a student who's acting out, who's not paying attention in class. And so I think it's good for me to remember that I don't necessarily know what's going on with that student. Why that student is so angry or upset probably has nothing to do with me at all. So what I can do is model good relationships, even if that student doesn't want to be kind to me. I can be kind to the other students to show that student that I care. And then mirroring back to the student what you're seeing. So if I have a student who throws a book and is angry, I can say, I see that you're angry. You have two choices. You may go pick up the book and join us, and I hope you do, or you can leave the classroom, or whatever it is that you want to do. So I'm giving choice and I'm acknowledging the feeling so that student can hopefully understand what it is that they're doing and manage the behavior. One of the easiest things we can do to help all of our students feel safe is to be predictable. So if we have schedules and routines, that's one of the most important things we can do to help students feel safe. Often students who have lived with trauma, their lives have been unpredictable. Maybe a parent struggles with substance abuse, and so that parent isn't always predictable. So we can provide a safe place with a predictable schedule and routine. We can write the tasks on the board or on the sheet of paper we're using, so the students know what's coming next and what they can expect, how much time they have left. There are no surprises. This example about the door is kind of interesting, I think, if you're in a physical classroom, which a lot of us aren't currently. But for some students, if you have the door closed, they can feel trapped, and that can make them very anxious and stressed. But for other students, if you have the door open, that can make them feel exposed, like people can see them, and that can make them feel unsafe. So what can we do? We can't do everything for every student. So one thing I would suggest is leaving the door, if possible, slightly open, and then letting students choose where they sit. So if they feel like they need to have a quick out, they can sit near the door. And if they feel like they want to feel safe and unseen, they can sit in a corner. And of course, always we can just reinforce, you're safe, this is what's happening next, things like that. If it's possible, giving students choices can be a really important thing to help them feel safe in the classroom. Maybe it's seating, like I had just mentioned. Maybe it's the opportunity to work with a partner or by themselves if they prefer. Sometimes there's an opportunity to give choice in assignments, or if you want them to do a writing task, maybe they can have a choice among a couple of those two. And again, that just helps students to feel powerful, like they have some choice and some power in the situation, when they might often live in circumstances where they don't have a lot of power. If it's possible, one thing that I have found helpful is one time a school term, my students can turn in an assignment 24 hours late, and they don't have to tell me why. So they just have that one opportunity. I don't need to know why it's late. They can just submit it late. And that way they don't have to explain, and maybe they can get that work done. So if we can help students to identify how they're feeling, that can be really helpful too. And I actually use this with some of my friends when they all know I'm strange talking about brain science, but if I'm feeling stressed out, I might say, I'm in my downstairs brain right now, give me a minute. And just by acknowledging that, then they know, okay, she is stressed out right now, I will give her some space. And so it's kind of a good communication skill to have. And we can ask students how they feel. This chart I like a lot. So again, I can have students indicate how they're feeling. And if I see that the whole class is in the red, then I know that people are angry, and maybe what I'm doing in class that day, I might want to change. Students, even if they don't speak a lot of English, when I'm teaching English, for example, I can have them put a little marker on how they're feeling. And as the class continues, they can move that around. So that helps me see how they're feeling. That also can help them to learn how to identify those feelings. We talked about stress relieving activities like the breathing. Sometimes people will do yoga or dancing. Art is great too. And if we can predict what might be stressful. So if there's going to be a new speaker in the class, if we can warn students about that ahead of time, that can be helpful. Here, sometimes we have fire drills, so practices in case there's a fire, letting students know that alarm is going to be going off. This is what we will do. That can be helpful too, so there aren't surprises. So, how can we help students build those ladders to the upstairs brain, to build new neural pathways? All of these, again, I think are just good teaching practices, but if we think about how maybe someone was in an accident and they have to learn how to walk again, what will we have to do with that person? We'll have to practice and practice and practice. And it's the same. It's the same when you're learning in general, but it's especially harder when students have been stressed, they've experienced trauma, they're having trouble concentrating and memorizing things. So repetition and review, presenting information in multiple modes. So I will show it, I will say it, maybe I'll add movement to it. Using visuals can be very helpful too. And then again, providing step-by-step instructions and modeling. This is an example of how we would do this. This is how we might do this task. Here's an example. Just do step one. All of those can help students or adults who've experienced trauma to build those neural pathways to the upstairs brain and have stronger learning. We always want our students to feel safe and valued. So if we can use authentic materials, if we can let them bring in some materials, if we can choose texts that have relatable content, things our students are interested in, anytime we can let students express themselves through music, art, movement, that can be very helpful too. And then I'll talk about this one in the next slide, but being really careful when we're requiring students to provide information connected to families, and always trying to focus on hope and on the present. So, again, I can't see you, but I hope you'll take a second to think about these. So these are some examples of things that either I have done personally as a teacher, or I have observed other teachers doing, that I would now say, now that I know about trauma and brain science, I would now say that these are not trauma sensitive. So I'm going to have you take a second to think about these 4 examples, why they might be traumatic for a student, and what you might do instead. So I'm going to let you think for just a minute. Okay, so there are all kinds of things that you can do instead. These are just some that I have come up with. So for this first one, this is actually something that I had done when I was teaching high school secondary English. And my students read Walt Whitman's poem, Song of Myself. So I had them bring in an item that celebrated their past, one that celebrated their present, and one that celebrated their future. So they had to bring in something and share with the class. Now, knowing what I know about trauma, I think that I would change this assignment just a little bit, and I would have students share an item that celebrates their past or their present or their future. So the reason for this would be, let's say one of your students has had some really horrible things that have happened in their past. We don't want to upset them again or force them to think about the past if we don't have to. The same for the future. For some students, the future might be very uncertain and scary, so maybe they won't want to do that. For other students, maybe that's exciting, something positive for them to think about. So with this tiny little change, we can be more sensitive to our students and not re-traumatize them. I observed a teacher, she was my student who was practicing to be a teacher, and she had her students write about a time they felt scared. And I was observing in the back of the class, and I saw many of the students get really upset. So forcing them or encouraging them to think about a time that they were scared can again re-traumatize them, put them back in that place that was unsafe. So instead, we might have them write about a time they felt a strong emotion. And it could be a time they were scared, or a time that they were happy or excited or nervous. And again, we're still having the students write and think. We're just changing that a little bit, paying attention to those students who might be struggling emotionally. The same with something you did this summer. Maybe it was a bad summer. Maybe there isn't a great fun story to tell. So we could say, tell us something you did or you wish you would have done. Tell me about your best summer. We can change it just a little bit. And then this last one, asking the parents the story of how you got your name, or any kind of family tree genealogy type of assignment can be really hard for students if they've been adopted, if they don't know their parents. if their parents are unhealthy, if their parents are sick and aren't able to talk to them, that can all be really traumatizing for students. And what I have found is the students will not tell me that they're upset, they just won't do the assignment. So if we can change it just a little bit, so they're still learning, maybe they can ask anyone the story of their name. Maybe they can look up what their name means. Maybe they could write about what they wish they were named and why. So with just a little change, our instruction can be more trauma sensitive. All right. So secondary trauma and compassion fatigue. And here is where we'll switch from talking about students to talking about teachers. So sadly, research shows us that teaching is stressful, and actually we don't need research to tell us that, right? This is I will be starting my 27th year teaching, and it's stressful all the time. So teachers experience as much stress as paramedics and police officers. It was ranked as the #1 most stressful job in the UK. And here in the States, 40% of teachers in the US leave their job within the first 5 years. So we know that teaching is hard and it can be stressful. It also is amazing and the best job in the whole world, in my opinion. But we need to be really careful about this secondary trauma and compassion fatigue. So secondary trauma, if my student has experienced trauma and my student tells me about it, it's obviously not as traumatic to me as the person who has experienced it, but it can still affect me emotionally. So I go home and I can't stop thinking about it. I feel so bad for this student. My heart hurts for this student. I don't know what to do for them. That's secondary trauma. And we found that it impacts the body, not to the extent that primary trauma does, but it does impact us. We might feel stressed and anxious. We might have trouble sleeping. Compassion fatigue is a little bit different. And so what compassion fatigue is when you have a lot of students who've experienced a lot of different types of trauma and stress, and they have told you and told you and told you, and you kind of just get numb to it. So for example, if my friend says, "Oh, I'm having such a terrible day. I didn't get my second cup of coffee," I might say, "Second cup of coffee? That's not a bad day. My student's house just burnt down. That's struggle." So I might trivialize a situation or minimize it because I have compassion fatigue. So what can we do to try to mitigate compassion fatigue or secondary trauma effects? So when you're on an airplane and they're going through the safety procedures, they tell you to put your own oxygen mask on first. And that is because you cannot help someone else if you are not strong. And so we really need to remember that it's important to take care of ourselves, our own physical, mental, emotional health. We cannot be good teachers and supportive for our students if we are tired and stressed. So we need to eat well and sleep well. We need to have some fun. If it's possible, we need to leave work at work and say, "I'm not working right now. When I'm at home, I'm doing home stuff. When I'm working, I'm working." Now, I know a lot of us are working from home right now, so that becomes a little more challenging, but trying to set boundaries. Research shows that having access to similar others can be really, really helpful. And so this is not to complain to your fellow colleagues, but check in with them. Teachers understand what it's like to be a teacher and how stressful that is. And my teacher friends understand in ways that my family members don't, because they're not teachers. So checking in with them, how are you doing? Making time for one another, talking and sharing and encouraging one another, it's really important. And of course, if you are feeling overwhelmed and stressed, it's important always to seek professional support or help. So, to conclude, and I am way under time, but I think it's important to realize the prevalence of trauma. When we think about all of those things that can cause trauma, it's likely that the majority of our students have experienced some sort of trauma at some point in their lives. It's also important to recognize those impacts of trauma when we think about that the brain, and how it's harder to pay attention. It's harder to control those emotions when you've had trauma. And so it might not be that the student is just being mean. It might be that physically they cannot control themselves. We can respond with action. We can do some of those strategies like offering choice and routines and structures and supporting our students. And those are ways that we can resist re-traumatizing as well. Thinking of those instead of doing this, those are other things that we can do to support all of our students, and then taking care of ourselves and one another. So that concludes my portion of this, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Janine. It's very interesting and very useful for us, since we are, well, most of us are educators, the one that are here, you know, so it's very valid and very useful, definitely. We're gonna give maybe a couple of minutes for the audience to post questions in the questions and answers box, please. We're not gonna be able to answer all of the questions, but we're gonna try to do our best, okay? So let's wait a couple of minutes and then we will start with the questions. Okay, well, we have here the first question, Janine. Okay, currently, many schools are doing remote learning due to COVID-19. What are some trauma-sensitive teaching strategies for online learning? Wow, what a question, eh?
Thank you. So some of the strategies will be the same. As far as routine and structure, I think that's really important in the online classroom. That adds one more level of stress. But it can also be really important to, for example, not require students to show their background. If they live in a home that is unsafe, or there might be some things going on behind them, if we cannot force them to show that, if we are comfortable with having them cover their face, if they don't feel safe having their face out there for other people to potentially see, maybe they can have a virtual background. Maybe not requiring them to speak if they need to be on mute. Just if there's a lot of chaos in the background. Those are a couple of things that come to my mind.
Okay, Janine, thank you. Okay, here we have another question. What are some strategies for combating secondary trauma when teaching at a distance?
I think that I personally, I said I had taught for 27 years, and I personally think that teaching at a distance is more stressful than teaching face to face. And one of the things that I have trouble with is because it's on the computer. I never get away from the computer. My students are emailing questions all the time, and it becomes harder for me to take a break. It also can be harder for me to connect with family or friends, or to go outside and do some things for fun. So I have personally X'd out time in my day that I will not do work. Usually in the evening, I try to say I won't work between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. or something like that, and forcing myself to do some activities that are fun, that are just for me. Again, putting that oxygen mask on first. It can be harder when we're constantly in front of screens. So I think we have to plan to get away from that screen if possible.
Okay, well, that's a good recommendation. There is another case here, a particular case. It says, regarding activities for students who still don't know how to write yet, like drawing my or your family, it's a very common activity. How would you suggest to adapt it?
So I think we can talk about families in general, and that families can look a lot of different ways, and that, maybe our friends or a pet or a neighbor can be a supportive system like a family to us. And so we can talk about traditional families, but maybe we add in a friend or a neighbor or a priest or a minister or a teacher. It can be a different type of family. And I don't think we need to not talk about families at all, but I think we need to be really careful with focusing intently on, tell me about your mother, for example. That could be stressful for a student.
Okay, let's go with another question that says, how can you manage these kind of problems with big groups of students?
that is really hard too, right? So one of the things that we've been trying to do, and by big group, in this case, I'm talking 100 to 200. So if you're talking more than that, I think this will be really hard. But once a week, I call it individual contact, at least one time a week. So I try to check in individually with each student at least one time a week, whether it's via Zoom, or it's an email, or it's a phone call, whatever it happens to be. I can't get to all 200 in one day, but I can make sure I'm making contact once a week, giving that student a little bit of attention. I'm not sure if that really answers your question.
Yeah, definitely. I will say in these particular cases, we need to try to individualize the attention somehow, because working with big groups will be more difficult and maybe not very productive at the same time. Yeah. Well, thank you, Janine. Thank you for answering all the questions. It's been a pleasure to have you here. Yeah, but don't go yet. We're not finished yet. I'm gonna give extra information in case the participants are interested in the master program. So I'm gonna share. Okay, I'm gonna say, well, Okay, can you see? Janine, can you see the presentation? Yeah, okay, thank you. So, okay, well, I'm gonna say this part in Spanish in case we have an audience who don't understand Spanish. The presentation is in Spanish, by the way. Bueno, esta es nuestra oferta de maestría del programa de Pedagogía de los idiomas nacionales y extranjeros, con mención en enseñanza en inglés. Cabe recalcar que tenemos docentes de francés, de alemán o de cualquier otro idioma. Sin embargo, como la cátedra se da en el idioma inglés, por eso se requiere, ¿no?, una suficiencia en el idioma inglés. Esta maestría está dirigida a profesionales en ciencias de la educación, lingüística inglesa o cualquier otro idioma, psicología o un título en otra área con suficiencia en el idioma inglés, ya que la maestría es dada 100% en inglés. Y obviamente lo recomendable es que tenga experiencia en el ámbito educativo, sea como docente, como administrativo, que también los tenemos como alumnos, ¿no? Esta es nuestra malla curricular. Como podemos ver, está compuesta por 3 ciclos, y al empezar el segundo ciclo, usted empieza su trabajo de titulación. Es decir, 3 ciclos equivalente a 3 semestres, ¿no? En 3 semestres usted estaría graduado del programa. La modalidad de estudio es 100% online, dura 18 meses, y los horarios que manejamos usualmente es sábados y domingos de 9 a 4, y eventualmente se podrían dar viernes y sábado, ¿no? Esto depende de la disponibilidad del docente. Para la admisión al programa, necesitamos aprobar el curso propedéutico, que muchos han de ver, ya lo conocen, en el cual se les dará formación en ofimática, en forma general sobre la plataforma Moodle de la Universidad Casa Grande, y pensamiento abstracto. No es necesario dar otro test después del curso, solamente debe aprobar el curso, que es de 2 sábados, ¿no? El certificado B2 es un requisito. El certificado B2 de suficiencia en inglés no es necesario que lo tenga al iniciar el programa. Sin embargo, mientras usted estudia su programa de maestría, usted puede presentar el mismo, ¿no? Entre los aceptados están los de Cambridge, FCE o IELTS, Michigan, el ECC, el TOEFL, el TOEIC, ITEP, Pearson, etc. Bueno, estos son exámenes, ¿no?, que los estamos aceptando actualmente, ¿no? Esta es en forma general cómo se ve nuestra plataforma virtual, el campus virtual donde ustedes tienen todas las materias y donde los docentes suben todo el material y pueden estar en constante interacción con los mismos. El proceso de admisión, bueno, los documentos principales es la solicitud de ingreso, la hoja de vida, copia de cédula de identidad, copia del título de 3er nivel, certificado por la universidad que lo otorgó o notarizado, el histórico de notas, este debe ser original o certificado, certificado laboral o académico, copia del título de bachiller o acta de grado, que hoy en día ya se lo descarga también en internet, bueno, hoja de vida que ya lo repetí, y una foto tamaño carnet. Básicamente, ¿cómo usted puede financiar la maestría? La inversión que usted va a hacer después de la inscripción es de $6.300. Tenemos distintos descuentos del 30, 25 o 10%, dependiendo de su caso, ¿no? Hay un descuento especial para los docentes que se afilien o están afiliados al Fondo de Cesantía del Magisterio de Educación, los cuales se hacen acreedores a un 30% de descuento, una gran oportunidad para los docentes de ser admitidos a un programa de maestría de alta calidad, ¿no? También tenemos un 25% de descuento con un solo pago, 10% de descuento a docentes que pertenecen al Mineduc o al MIES. Y tenemos también, bueno, el postulante puede diferir también sus pagos hasta 48 meses con tarjeta de crédito, dependiendo de la entidad financiera con la cual de su preferencia, ¿no? Estos son los bancos con los cuales hemos venido trabajando. Los invitamos a registrarse al propedéutico, que se va a dar en 2 sábados. No es del 22 al 29, son solo los 2 sábados, de 9 de la mañana a 6 de la tarde, ¿no? Aproximadamente. Las inscripciones están abiertas para cualquier programa de maestría de los que tenemos en el área de educación, incluyendo los de la maestría en pedagogía, obviamente, ¿no? Y para más información acerca del programa de maestría, específicamente puede escribirnos a maestría-medioinglés@casagrande.edu.es y les podremos aclarar todas las dudas que tengan. Muchas gracias por su atención. Los dejo con Kelly.
Gracias, estimado. Les agradecemos también a los presentes, también a nuestra panelista, la doctora Yanine, a usted, Hugo, y a nuestra estimada Norma. En estos momentos les pedimos a los participantes que se queden unos minutos más para poderles copiar en el chat el link del formulario, el cual tendrán que llenar para poder obtener su certificado de haber asistido al seminario del día de hoy. Respecto al formulario, queremos dar las siguientes indicaciones. Les rogamos ingresar bien sus correos electrónicos, ya que si estos tienen algún problema ortográfico, no están bien escritos, alguna tilde, etcétera, bueno, el certificado pues saldrá con esos errores y en el caso del correo pues no podrá llegar a la persona que lo esté llenando. Como el formulario se cierra hasta la medianoche, les rogamos poder ingresar apenas se coloque el link y puedan llenar sus datos de la manera correcta. No se aceptarán pedidos posteriores de correcciones o envíos por no llegar los certificados. Como hemos tenido gran acogida en estos seminarios, la entrega de los certificados ya no se está realizando al siguiente día de haber llenado el formulario, sino dentro de 3 a 4 días como máximo. Entonces, para que las personas que aún no han recibido los certificados tal vez de webinars anteriores, ha habido una pequeña demora, como ya les mencioné, debido a la gran acogida que hemos tenido, por lo cual le pedimos un poquito de paciencia, ¿no? Entonces voy a hacer voy a copiar en este momento en el chat el link para que las personas puedan acceder y de esta manera puedan llenar el formulario. Lo vamos a seguir agregando, copiando algunas veces en el chat para que así todos puedan acceder al mismo. Y después, dentro de unos minutos, daremos cierre a la plataforma. En estos momentos seguimos copiando el link para que las personas puedan acceder al mismo. Bueno, vamos a dar cierre a la plataforma. Agradecemos a todos los presentes, así como a los panelistas por este seminario.